Welcome to Chapter 2 of Conservation Biology. Today we're going to look at what is biodiversity. So we may have heard this word before or not, so we're going to see what is this. So it's very likely that you've heard the term biodiversity in the news or in a book you've read or maybe even a movie. So for yourself, come up with some definitions. What to you, when you hear that term or that phrase, what's that mean? Okay, so the textbook definition for biodiversity is the richness, abundance, and variability of organisms and the ecological processes that link them to one another. So this is a pretty complex thing, this biodiversity. So that's what we're going to spend the rest of this chapter talking about. Biodiversity is going to consist of three things, or three kind of levels we can think about. Okay, so we have species diversity. This is going to be the number of different individual species in a given ecosystem. If there's oak trees and pine trees and frogs, those would be different species. Genetic diversity is going to be the variety of genetic traits within a population. Like in humans, you have blonde hair, red hair, brown hair. That's variability, but we're all still the same species. And then ecosystem diversity is going to be the variety of habitats and niches for a given species. And you're like, I don't know what that word niche means yet. Well, that's okay. We're going to get to it. That's ecosystem level diversity. And to be able to understand this genetic diversity and what a population is and what a species is and all that stuff, got to do a little bit of basic genetics. You could get an entire college degree in genetics, but we're going to go over it in like one slide. Okay, so within all things, you, me, butterflies, frogs, trees, we have these things called chromosomes. And chromosomes are basically packages of DNA, and found along these chromosomes are things called genes. And a gene is basically, you can think of a gene as a piece of DNA that does something. That's pretty much what a gene is. It's gonna code for a protein. It's gonna do something. So genes are kind of like the functional units of DNA. Okay, so in our example here, we have two chromosomes. Like you and I have two sets of chromosomes. You got one set from mom, one set from dad. Most organisms are kind of like this. And so on one chromosome, you get a gene for flower. You get this gene for flower color. And on one chromosome, it says make purple flowers. On the other chromosome, it says make white flowers. So these are what we call alleles. These differences, these differences in a given trait or a given gene, we call an allele. So they code for the same thing. They're both creating flower color in this organism, but they're different colors of flower. This would be like hair color in humans, or something. Could be similar. And so this cool, interesting thing about sexually reproducing organisms is that we do this thing called recombination. And every time we reproduce, we do recombination of genes and chromosomes. When the sperm and egg unite, you only send, like if you're male, your sperm has half your DNA. If you're female, your eggs have half your DNA. And so the process of creating that sperm and egg jumbles up your DNA to make whole new combinations, whole new chromosomes. And then once they fuse together and make that new offspring, it now has a totally new set of DNA. It has some from mom, some from dad, and so it's going to be a little bit different. And so this increasing in difference is going to increase the genetic diversity within the population. This recombination, the fact that your child isn't like literally exactly half your DNA and half your mate's DNA, there's some whole new combinations that get created in this process. So that increases the diversity. Okay, so within a population, and a population is just all the individuals of a species in an area. So that's what a population is. We can look at their DNA and we can see different stuff happening. So if you physically, zoom in, and you don't actually use a microscope, you do this chemically, but imagine you zoom in, you look at the DNA. And so the pair of genes that that organism has, we call that the genotype. And in the case of this, fox here, our first genotype is going to be big A, big A. Okay. And so then we have another genotype. We'll call this one here. It could be big A, little a. So we got these two different genotypes. Genotype 1, genotype 2. And so that's what the DNA is on the inside. But that gets acted upon by your environment, where you live and what's going on. So see, we have genotype 1, genotype 2. Both of these organisms live in the same environment, the green square. So they grow, they develop, they go through life, and then they become adults. They look different. White nose versus brown nose fox. Even though they lived in the same place, they had different genotypes, so it created different phenotypes. And phenotype is your physical manifestation of a genotype. So it's what we can actually see with our naked eyes. It could be behaviors, it could be physical colors, things like that, things that we can see. Well, this other cool and interesting thing happens. We can have identical twins. So we have genotype 1, genotype 2. These are exactly the same. Individual 1, individual 2 with exactly the same genotype. So these are identical twins. But then we take them, we put them in different places. One goes to the green square, one goes to the tan square. Now, because the environment is affecting how you express your DNA, now they look different. So even though their genotype is identical, the phenotype is still different because they're in different environments. So this is just to show us that the environment that an organism lives in plays a role in how the genotype gets expressed as a phenotype. Okay. So all these different genotypes, you can imagine you're in a population, you've got lots of different genotypes. Some are going to, and those genotypes lead to different phenotypes. Some are going to do better than others, right? So if you are some kind of bird that eats nuts and all the nuts happen to be really hard to crack this year, and you happen to be a bird whose phenotype is, I'm going to have bigger muscles and a bigger, stronger beak, I can crack these big nuts better, you're going to be more likely to survive and pass on your DNA. And so that idea is called fitness. And this it's not, I went to the gym and I got swole today. No, fitness in a biological sense means the ability to produce viable offspring relative to other members of your population. So that means you had more babies and they had more babies than your cousin or your neighbor of the same species. So a really good example of this in humans is with this thing called sickle cell anemia. You may have heard of this before. It's a disorder that causes your red blood cells to be misshapen. And they're supposed to be little circles like donuts, and this causes them to be long, spiky things, which reduces your ability to absorb oxygen, and it causes other organ problems. These things get trapped in your capillaries, and it causes some issues. But one thing sickle cell anemia does allow is for you to be resistant to malaria. So if your genotype, if mom and dad both gave you sickle cell anemia gene, then you're just going to die. But if mom gave you sickle cell anemia gene and dad did not, now you're what we call heterozygous. So you're not completely sickle cell anemic, right? And if you happen to live in a place where malaria is common, say Africa or India, now you aren't going to get malaria. So in these places where malaria kills a lot of people and has for a long time, being heterozygous for sickle cell anemia would reduce your fitness if you were in a place without malaria compared to a person who had no sickle cell. But in these regions, it makes you more fit. You're going to live longer and be able to live long enough to produce offspring, whereas your peers in your population are probably going to die from malaria. So that's why we see this genetic disorder, sickle cell anemia here, being really prevalent in people from African descent and still in Africa. It's fairly common. Some other ways we can affect phenotypes and genotypes within a population are through what we call artificial selection. So that sickle cell anemia was natural selection. The environment was causing, that mutation randomly happened, and the environment was selecting people who had one gene, one allele for sickle cell disorder. They did better than people who didn't have any. So the environment was like, hey, this is a pretty good thing to have here because malaria is so prevalent. Well, we as humans can, think, and so we can take populations and affect them and change them for our needs. So this idea of artificial selection is going to be the selection of traits that are favorable to us. Okay, so let's look at a wolf. Wolves, they're pretty mean and big and bad. But we took a wolf a long time ago, several thousand years ago, and started domesticating them. And now we've got all these things called dogs, whose ancestor is a wolf. If you got a Chihuahua or your Great Dane, either one, they come from the same ancestor. But we, through time, have bred dogs and selected for different traits. And that's why we have all these different breeds of dogs now. Another example is in food. So we have in Eastern Europe, there's this wild mustard. It's not a very big plant. You can eat it. It's small. Looks kind of like this. Through selective breeding and time, this one ancestor has given rise to all kinds of food crops like cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, broccoli, cauliflower. These are all the same species. They all come from the same ancestor, but now they look really different because we've selected for different things. Okay. Something we do inadvertently via artificial selection is we create pests that we can't kill. So the overuse of pesticides and antibiotics has led to really strong pests, like bed bugs that no insecticides will kill now. And we have disease-causing bacteria like MRSA that are resistant to antibiotics. And these are inadvertent examples of artificial selection. We did this, we caused it, but we didn't really do it on purpose. But since people did it, it's still called artificial selection. And these superbugs, like MRSA, should give you nightmares. There is now a strain of tuberculosis that no known antibiotics can kill. So, yeah, it's pretty scary. So, thus far we talked about, changing populations, changing wolves into dogs and that kind of thing. And given enough time, with enough selection pressure, we can create new species. In the history of life on Earth, it's only originated once within a single species. And we know this because all life on Earth has DNA and or RNA. And we have millions of species, and this process of creating a new species is called speciation. And what is DNA? DNA is just, here's a picture of the molecule DNA, and here's a picture of the molecule RNA. Basically, what these are a genetic code. They're what make us who and what we are. Okay. So because we can change the way things look. Like we can take a wolf, and through a lot of breeding and a lot of generations, we can make a Chihuahua and some other things. We developed this theory of evolution. And the guy who came up with this, his name was Charles Darwin. Alfred Russel Wallace also came up with the idea. Darwin came up with it first. It's a long story on how it happened, but Darwin's kind of more famous for it, but Wallace also independently came up with the idea. So what is evolution? There's a whole lot to the theory of evolution, but we're going to just look at a few of the mechanisms and points of it. So there's this idea of microevolution. And so if we look at the tortoises on the Galapagos Islands, the Galapagos tortoises have variations in their neck length. Like we have these that live in wet places with trees, they got really long necks. We have these that live in the more deserty places who have really short necks. And so they're still the same species. They can still interbreed with one another, but they're on their way to becoming separate species. And they evolve a lot slower than other species, mostly because these things can live 300, 400, 500 years old. And so their generation times are really long. And for evolution to enact on something, it has to be over generations. So, think bacteria who have generation times of minutes. Evolution can happen really fast. But on these tortoises that live 300 years, it's slower. On another island chain, on the Hawaiian Islands, we have what's called macroevolution has happened. And macroevolution is when you create new species, basically. And so a long time ago, a bird made it to Hawaii from the mainland. Well, it would have been several birds, or maybe a pregnant female bird that laid eggs. It could have been just one, but it's probably a few birds got blown in by a hurricane or something. And they're on these islands, and over time, all these different kinds of food sources are there. There's flowers, there's nuts, there's insects, there's fruit. And over time, different birds got better at eating these different foods, and we had different species evolve. And so now we've got all these different species of birds on the Hawaiian Islands that originated from this one ancestral bird. This took a long time. It didn't happen overnight. Okay. Having all these different species in an area is what we call a community. When that community interacts with abiotic factors, be that air, water, rock, things that aren't alive, that's what abiotic is. When the community interacts with that, then we have an ecosystem. So if we look at this, flooded woods, and we have this temporary forest pool. In the springtime, it's kind of wet in Kentucky. It gets flooded. Maybe August it dries up. But in the spring, it's flooded. So what do you think might be in there? Well, we've got all these trees and plants and salamanders and insects, all this stuff working together, maybe fighting each other, living in the same area. We have box elder trees. They can handle getting really wet like this and then drying out a little bit. We have sycamore trees. We have lots of sedges. When the water's there, we have this insect called caddisflies. They're aquatic in their life cycle, except when they're an adult. So they have to live in water when they're little babies, like the larvae here. We have salamanders. Salamanders like wet places. They probably come in here and lay eggs. Tadpoles, frogs lay eggs in water. And then algae, they have to live in water, right? So all these things are in the same ecosystem together, causing stuff to happen, working together. So within ecosystems, there's differences, right? So you can imagine in the pool in the swampy forest we just saw, it's going to be a little bit different if you're living up on a tree branch versus living down in the water. And so this is what we call habitat. And so that's going to be where a species lives. That's what its habitat is. Okay, that's where it lives. And the niche, I know earlier in earlier presentation said we'd define this. Niche is going to be an organism's role or function in the ecosystem or environment. So it's what's this thing do? Niche is kind of what's the job of this thing? How does it interact with other species and that sort of thing? So If we look at this flower, fire pink, it's going to require forest floors, and so it lives in the woods around here in Kentucky, on the hillsides. Well, it blooms really early in the springtime. It grows up and it blooms, and the reason it does this early in the spring is because it kind of gets a jump start before all the trees come out and make their leaves open up and take all the sunshine. So it's getting that little bit of sunshine before the trees absorb it all, and in order to get its flowering done. And so it's going to provide food for some animals, or especially insects that are pollinating. Okay, if we look at box turtles, their habitat, they're going to require woodland or grassland areas. They can, they're kind of more general in their habitat requirements, and they eat a lot of stuff. They eat a lot of vegetables. They can eat mushrooms and that sort of thing, and so they can disperse seeds. Sometimes they eat insects, and they can control insect populations by doing that. And if we look at this funky walking stick here, like we have walking sticks in Kentucky, they're not quite as elaborate as this Australian one. These things, their habitat is going to be, they look like a twig, right? They're called walking sticks for a reason, because they pretend to be sticks so predators don't eat them. So it's going to live in shrubs, pretending to be a leaf and a branch. It's going to eat other bugs, eat other insects that are smaller than it, but then bigger things might consume it, and so it's going to be food for big animals, birds and stuff like that. And so that's kind of the idea there. And within all ecosystems, there's only so much habitat to go around. There's only so much space, right? And so species will differentiate on how they use their habitat based on what other species are there. Like in the islands, right, with the birds we talked about in the Hawaiian Islands, that was called adaptive radiation. You had one species come in, tons of new species got formed. There wasn't any competition. So you could be kind of a crappy flower eater, but you'd still get all the flowers because there was nothing else trying to eat them. Well, in places where there's already other species, we have what's called competition. And we have this thing called the competitive exclusion principle. Basically, what this means is that no two species can occupy the same niche. One will eventually cause the other one to go extinct, right? And so part of niche is the habitat, right? It's like the location the species is, but it's also like in what it's doing and how it does it. So if we look at these barnacles, we're on the Atlantic Ocean here, and we're on a big rock, and we're looking at tides, right? In Kentucky we don't really have tides, but if you go to the ocean, you've been to the beach, the water goes up, water comes down. Okay. So there's these two species of mussels, the thalamus and balanus, or barnacles, not mussels. Okay. The thalamus, they're smaller, and they can handle being dry longer, because see, high tide, they're covered up, but then tide starts going down, they're dry. And so they're still dry, and they're still dry, and they're still dry. It comes all the way down to here, and it's coming back up, and they're still dry, and they're still dry, and now they're starting to get wet again. Now they're wet, now they're submerged. Versus these bigger guys, the balanus, they do better when they're underwater here, submerged, but they can't handle drying out as much. So this area of overlap, this area of competition, it's kind of like they're fighting it out. There's a few balanus, a few thalamus, but neither one of them is doing very good. We come down to the deep water here, the balanus is doing great. Higher up on the rocks, the thalamus is doing great. So they're excluding one another, right? Down here, if one of these guys came down here and tried to live, these would shove it out of the way or whatever and win. But if one of these tried to live up here, it would dry out too much and die, so these guys would win. So that's why we see this area of competition in the middle. There is no, there's nobody really winning, okay? So another thing that controls population size and where things live and how it goes are what we call limiting factors, okay? So in the southeastern U.S., we have these things called manatees. They're pretty awesome looking creatures. And they live in the rivers, the freshwater rivers in Florida. But there's only so much water, so much food, so that there's only so many manatees that can exist. And this, likewise in Kentucky and other parts of the eastern U.S., we have the staghorn sumac. And there's only so many staghorn sumac trees that can grow in an area because the forest can only support so many. So there's going to be limiting factors to this. And so what do you think might be, well, let's go back here. What do you think might be some limiting factors to the number of manatees that can live in a river? Maybe there's not enough food. Maybe there's too many boat propellers cutting them up. Right? Maybe it gets too salty. I mean, there's lots of reasons right there. Okay. But this fact that there's only so many manatees and only so many sumac trees leads us to this curve. It's called the logistic curve. All species, all life follows this pattern. We start out with a few, and we saw earlier on in the last chapter, human population, right? It looked like this for 10,000 years, and then the last 150 years is doing this. Well, it's doing this. We're somewhere in here. Where along this curve for humans, we don't know yet. But eventually, all ecosystems, all habitats, everything has limiting factors. There's a limit to how many things can be in an area, and then it levels off. And this leveling off point is what we call carrying capacity. This is the maximum number of individuals that that ecosystem can serve or contain. Okay, and in this generic model here, it's going to be 1,000 individuals. If we look at our y-axis on our graph here, we have 1,000. We come over, that's carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity could be, in the absence of other species or interacting with one another, but in reality, out there in the wilds, in a stream or in the forest, or walking down the sidewalk going to Walmart, species are always interacting. They're interacting with each other and with their environment, and so this causes stuff to happen, right? We have different forms of interaction, one of which is competition. So these two deer, they're fighting it out. They're competing against one another. Okay, so in competition, you have two kind of fighting each other. Okay, we have what's called predation. In this kind of interaction, something is eating something else. Something's predating it. Something, if a bird eats an insect, or in this case, the lions are eating the water buffalo, they're predators. A mutualism. So I guess the way it works, in this one, neither one really wins. And this one of them wins and one of them gets really hurt. In a mutualism, both species win. And so like in this picture here, this is an acacia from Australia. And this tree makes these swollen structures. And this here is a swollen structure. And that little hole in the middle is so that ants can crawl in here and live inside this thing. And it produces sweet nectar on the inside to keep the ants hanging out there. Well, what happens now, if you're a creature trying to eat this tree, you come along and start eating on my leaf, the ants are going to get ticked off because you're messing with their house now, and they're going to come sting you and bite you. And so now I have my own little security force of ants. Ants get a place to live and food. I get a security force of ants, so it's pretty cool. So that's what mutualism is. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. Commensalism is a little bit different, and in this case, it's the lichen growing on the tree, or maybe this is Spanish moss. This looks like Spanish moss, which is not a lichen at all. It's a bromeliad. It's a flowering plant. But so we've got the tree here, and the Spanish moss growing on it. So in commensalism, one species benefits, the Spanish moss, it's getting somewhere to live, while the other one, the tree, is neither harmed nor helped. So that's what commensalism is. And then we have parasitism. Look at those tapeworms. There was recently a report of a guy out in Washington State who really liked eating sushi, and he ate salmon sushi all the time. He went to the bathroom, and going number 2, and there was still something hanging there. So he reaches back, grabs a hold of it, and begins pulling. And he pulls out a 6-foot long tapeworm and puts it in a bag and drives himself to the doctor. But I think, wow, right? Wow, that would be insane. But he got it from eating the raw salmon. So in parasitism, what happens is one species is hurt a little bit and the other species benefits. But a good parasite doesn't want to kill its host. Versus a predator, right? So in a predation scenario, these lions, they really want to kill this thing. They want it to die right now. And that's what predators do. But a parasite wants to just kind of leech off of its host, right? Like a leech is a kind of parasite. So these worms are getting food from its host, so it doesn't want to kill it. It might hurt it some, but it wants it to stay alive so that it can keep mooching. Okay, so here's a little chart showing kind of the relationship between species in these 5 different kinds of interactions. So we got competition, predation, mutualism, commensalism, parasitism. These are the different ways that species can interact with each other. Okay, and showing the different scenarios there. Okay, so when those species interact, sometimes stuff eats stuff, right? Things get eaten. Okay, and so this is going to create what we call trophic levels. So out there in nature, we have what are called producers. You can think all life on Earth, everything you do, everything you have is possible because of plants. Without plants, you die, and everything dies. So it's kind of cool. So producers, and I use the word plants loosely because algae and cyanobacteria are in this group, but they all do what's called photosynthesis. They take sunshine and they make sugar out of it. It's like magic. So that's what producers do. They take sunshine and make sugar via the process of photosynthesis. And then we like sugar. Sugar is good. So then stuff eats them. And the stuff that eats them we call consumers. Consumers are going to eat the producers. They might eat each other also. Consumers have to eat something to get energy, like humans. Like we can't just go out, lay in the sunshine and get energy like a plant can. We have to eat that plant or that tiger or that cricket. Okay. And then finally we have decomposers. Decomposers are primarily fungi and bacteria, and these are what make stuff rot. So we take all those components of the cricket and of the tree and we rot it via decomposers, break it back down into its simple building blocks so that it can then be reused by the next round of producers and grow again. So it's a big circle. Because again, we're on planet Earth, spaceship Earth. We have no other one. And the resources we have here are all we got, and they get recycled in nature. This is how they get recycled. Decomposers break things down to be reused again by producers. And since there's this continuous cycling of stuff and being reused, we have to think about energy. Because those plants, they use sunshine, energy to make sugar, but you and I have to eat that sugar to get our energy. So what's this got to do with this law of thermodynamics thing? Well, the laws of thermodynamics they're things that came up with by physicists, but it applies to biology too. So the first law of thermodynamics is called the law of conservation of energy, and it states that energy cannot be created nor destroyed, but can be transformed, which is pretty cool. So we can take that energy that the plant has stored, see it took sunshine energy, stored it as chemical energy in the sugar it made, we can eat that and get some energy from it. However, the second law of thermodynamics states that it's called the law of entropy. And it says with each energy transformation, a certain loss of usable energy will occur. So the key here is usable, because you can't destroy the energy, right? Because that's what the first law says, you can't destroy it. It's always got to be there. But you can change it to some form that's unusable, like heat. So if we look at this food chain here, we can see the transformation of energy going from producers, which are the plants, up the food chain, right? So we got a plant doing photosynthesis, getting energy from the sun. And then a rabbit eats the plant. So now we transferred the energy from this to this. And then we have a fox eat the rabbit. And then eventually the fox dies or probably gets hit by a car. And then it's going to be decomposed by scavengers, bugs, insects, fungi, bacteria. It's going to rot, and then it's going to go back into simple components and those into the dirt, and that'll get uptaken again by plants. But we see these squiggly lines. So these lines are like energy transfer. Okay, the squiggles are what we're going to lose due to entropy. The law of entropy says that every time we go through here, we're going to lose some energy. And we lose that energy as heat. And that's why you and I are warm-blooded. We can go outside when it's 60 degrees and we don't suddenly become hypothermic and can't move because our body produces heat. That heat keeps us warm. It also is lost. It's a lost form of energy there. So if we look within an ecosystem, going up these trophic levels from primary producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, and then we get tertiary consumers, which is not listed in this one, but it would be some, if an eagle ate that fox, that would be what was going on here. So every time we go up a trophic level, we only transfer 10% of the energy, right? So if we look at energy is measured in this unit called joules, and we lose 90% each time we transform it. So here the sun puts in 1,000,000. Primary producers, they got 10,000. Primary consumers, now they've got 1,000. Secondary consumers, they get 100. Tertiary, they only get 10. And so this is called the rule of 10. So each time you move up the food chain, each time you go higher, you lose 90% of the energy. You can think of it in reverse in that it takes 90% more energy to make it. So in humans, let's imagine these primary producers. This could be corn and soybeans. Primary consumers, that's a cow, right? So it takes 100 times more energy for us to grow 1 joule of cow than it does 1 joule of soybean. So this is one argument, for people to eat more plants, is it takes a whole lot more energy to grow meat. And this is also why in natural ecosystems, there's not very many tertiary consumers, like big carnivores. Think like wolves and bears and hawks and eagles. There's not all that many of them compared to mice and bugs and deer. Right? It's because of this rule of 10. We've got a duck. We've got this fern, which is a pretty cool fern called a zola. It fixes nitrogen, so it puts nitrogen into the water. We got some weeds. We got rice. This is our rice paddy. We could be in Thailand or China or Vietnam or someplace right here, right? So, or Arkansas. We grow a lot of rice in Arkansas and Texas. So we got rice growing. We got bugs. Okay, and then we got the farmer. The farmer has the ducks in there. They eat the ducks as a source of meat, a source of protein. They provide some feed to the ducks. Maybe this is corn or rice hulls or something, but they're feeding them some. Okay. The duck's going to poop. That poop is going to be used as nutrients by the tiny little plankton that are in the pond. And those little plankton will get eaten by the fish, and the fish will get eaten by the farmer. So there's this big whole cycle of things. But if we look at all the arrows kind of show who eats what, where the energy's going. The arrows, show where energy goes. That's what the arrows are doing. If we look, the fish, it's got quite a bit of arrows. The person eats it. It eats the fleas. Its poop goes into the soil and feeds the rice and the weeds. Well, the duck, it's got a whole lot of arrows going on, right? Versus, say, like the fleas. Fleas got 3. Ducks got, okay, coming here, going there, coming here, going there. Ducks got all kinds of stuff going on. So if we take the duck out of this ecosystem, stuff's going to happen, right? So we're going to have insects galore on our rice, and so the duck's not going to be able to eat them. The duck's not going to be eating the weeds, so the weeds are going to take over, and now our rice is going to be eaten by insects and getting crowded out by weeds, and we're not going to get very much rice, and we're not going to be able to eat the duck. So it's just going to be, lots of bad stuff's going to happen. So when we have a species like that, like the duck, we have a special name for them. We call those a keystone species. And this keystone species gets its name from this ancient Roman architecture where they would build these stone arches with no mortar. They're just rocks laid up against each other. Now they're cut pretty precisely and everything, but there's this in the middle of the arch is what's called the keystone. This thing supports the whole structure. You could maybe take one of these out, it'll slump down a little, but it'll still stand. If you take this one out, the entire thing collapses. And so the central stone in an arch, and without it, the arch falls, and so that's why we call these species keystone species, because without them, the ecosystem kind of goes to pot. It just falls apart, okay? So if we look at some examples of keystone species, in many cases, they're not the most abundant species within the population. They don't have the most individuals, but they are often among the most important. Okay, so if we look at this, here's an ecosystem. If we look at proportional biomass, so low to high, I mean, biomass is a way of measuring, how much of that thing is there in the area. So we got not very much of it, we got a whole lot of it. And then we look at the impact of the species, right? So we have rare things, they're going to have low impact and low biomass. So think, a rare butterfly, a rare moss, a rare flower. Low impact, high biomass is going to be common stuff like grass and shrubs and oak trees in the woods, that kind of thing. High impact, some other species of trees, prairie grasses. If you're in the prairie, a deer. These are going to be the dominant species in the ecosystem, but they're not the keystones. Keystone species often have a really high impact, but they're in low abundance. There's not a whole lot of them, but they're really important. These can be disease-carrying organisms like ticks. Bats, they eat insects outside of caves, and they go back into the caves in the daytime and poop, and that allows for the whole ecosystem inside the cave to get energy from the bat guano. Or a wolf. Wolves are super important, and later on, I'll have a video posted about the wolves in Yellowstone to watch and see how important they are. But these keystone species, they're among some of the most important in the system, right? So like flying foxes on their island dwellers, I believe all flying foxes live on islands. Not 100% on that, but most of them do for sure. And these things eat fruit, and often they disperse the seeds of all these things they're eating, and they're super important for that. And dung beetles, these little bugs that take balls of poop, roll them up, and bury them with a seed with an egg. They lay an egg inside the poop, and they make a ball, and they roll it around, and they bury it. And then their baby, the egg hatches, and it eats the poop. That's what dung beetles do. Within their ecosystems, these things are both keystone species. You might think it's a bug rolling a ball of poop. That can't be a keystone, but within the scale of where it lives and what it does, it is a keystone species. So just like we have species that are super important and super integral to the ecosystem, we can also have resources like that. And so these we call keystone resources. So think of like a hot springs, a mineral pool in Yellowstone National Park. This is going to be a really unique habitat. Lots of things are adapted to living in it. And so these mineral pools, they're keystone resources. A hollow tree trunk. Say you're a raccoon and you're living in the woods. Well, your option is to sit on the ground underneath a tree that fell over and maybe get eaten by coyotes, or climb up in this tree that's hollow and live inside of it. So hollow tree trunks, that's just an example of what could live in. A lot of other stuff lives in hollow tree trunks, but they're a keystone resource. Without them, their ecosystem can fall apart. Rotten wood. There's a tremendous amount of things that live in and on rotting wood. And then there's things that eat those things. Think bear. So all the beetle larvae living in the rotten wood, bears like to eat those, and so they come and roll the logs over and eat them. Salamanders live underneath the rotten wood, so rotten wood's a keystone resource. A deep pool, and you're like, what is a deep pool? Well, imagine a creek. If you got a creek near your house, or you've been to creeks, you're going to have really shallow riffles, and then you're going to have slow spots that are deeper. And these deep pools, let's say we have a drought, right? So it's summertime. This summer it seems like it's rained every single day here in Kentucky, but let's say it doesn't rain for a while. Well, the creek starts drying up. You're a fish, you're a salamander, you're a crawdad, you're an insect. You can move into this deep pool and survive the drought. Then after the drought's over, you can move back into your shallower areas where you normally hang out. But these deep pools, if it didn't exist, you would have died. And so they're a keystone resource. So now we've kind of looked at the levels of how species interact, like the trophic levels, stuff eats stuff, genetic diversity, what a keystone species is, and now let's look at how we measure this biodiversity thing. How do we apply numbers to biodiversity? How do I compare a forest to a grassland and that sort of thing? So let's look at this. Okay, so we got these two measures. There's lots more complex measures of biodiversity out there. These are kind of the two simplest: species richness and species evenness. Species richness is the simplest measurement of biodiversity, and it's the number of different species in an ecosystem. So literally you just count how many different things are there, you get a number. That's richness. Evenness takes into account the relative abundance of those different species. Like you could have two ecosystems who have 5 species, right? So their richness is going to be 5 in both of them. But in one, you've got 4 of those species only has 1 individual, and the 5th one has 50. And so its evenness is going to be really not very even. Versus the other one has 5 of all 5 species, so it's going to be pretty even. So that's kind of how that works. And so we use these measurements a lot in conservation. And there's more complex measurements and metrics and numbers and stuff, but the point of these numbers and the more complicated ones that involve a little bit more math, it's all so that we can compare one ecosystem to another one. We have some way of empirically comparing them. And so that's what these are for. So let's imagine we're a botanist, and we're interested in determining the species richness of trees in 3 different elevations of forest. We got valley, we got mid-level, and we got hilltop. And so this botanist goes out and randomly samples 1-acre plots at each of these ecosystems, down in the valley, on the middle of the hill, and up on top of the ridge. And so here's the results we get. So we're looking at this chart here. So here's our trees. We got slippery elm, we got black oak, red maple, silver maple, American beech, and sycamore. Okay, and so we're looking at the numbers of where they're at and how many individuals we find in these different places, right? So in the valley, we get 5 slippery elms, 5 silver maples, 5 beech, and 10 sycamore. Right? And then over here on the hilltop, we get 10 black oaks, 10 red maples, and 5 beech. So we're looking at these, and we're like, okay, what's our richness? Well, if we look in the valley, we got some of these, so there's 1. We got some of these, there's 2. Some of these 3. Some of these 4. Right? So we just go 1, 2, 3, 4. So we got 4 for our richness here. In the mid-level, we got some of these. We got some of everything, right? So we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the richness there is 6, right? So see, we got 4, we got 6, and then over on the hilltop, we get the lowest with 3. So that's how richness works. It's just simply how many different things are there, right? And so evenness, we use that as a way of kind of comparing across places, right? So the evenness rank for these 3, 1 is the most even. Then we have, the mid-level has a rank of 1, which is the most. Valley is 2, and the ridgetop is 3, the least even, right? Because we got a bunch of 0s and 10s and 5. Okay, and the way we calculate evenness is what we call H over H max. And what is this H? How do we calculate it? It's going to be negative sigma, which means sum of the proportion pi of each one times the log of pi. So this is, you don't have to do this math. We're not going to, on the test and stuff, you're not going to be held to knowing this equation or anything. But just know that this is, one of the simpler ways of measuring biodiversity. This is the equation for it. So we can now look at 3 different ecosystems in Kentucky and in Florida, because the Everglades aren't in Kentucky. And we can compare them a little bit, right? So we work for a conservation organization, say the Nature Conservancy, which is one of our biggest and best conservation organizations here in the U.S. And we got some money, and we're like, we want to save an area. Here's our 3 options. Which one are we going to save? Right? And so if we look at area, we're like, wow, 12.5 million acres, 1.5 million acres, 52,000 acres. So this one's really small. This one's super huge. Okay, if we look at endangered species, because that's what we're really worried about. Within conservation, really common things, we don't worry about them too much because we're not endangering them so much yet. So we look at endangered things, right? So if we look at the number of endangered species, Eastern Kentucky's got 50, Florida's got 30, and Mammoth Cave's got 50 also. So we're like, well, if we're just going on endangered stuff, we got a lot more here and we got a lot more here. Okay. But then if we look at animal richness, how many different species of animals are, like, whoa, there's a whole bunch of different animals in Eastern Kentucky. Quite a few here in the Everglades, but not very many. The proportion of these both is not very many that are endangered. In Mammoth Cave, there's only 130 different animals, but wow, 50 of them are endangered. Right, so if we're looking at this and we had some money and we're like, well, what do we need to save? What do we need to preserve? We need to think about some stuff. Well, first is, what proportion of that area is in danger? Is it really small? Is it really big? So if Eastern Kentucky's 12.5 million acres, we're probably not going to destroy all 12.5 million acres very quickly, right? So it's going to take a while. And there's 50 endangered species spread out in this massive area. Now, in reality, a lot of these endangered things are really limited geographically, but for our little thought experiment here, we're going to pretend they're just spread all over the place. So the odds of any of them going extinct are fairly low because we've got this huge area. Okay, the Everglades, still a pretty big area, 1.5 million acres, and only 30 of the species are endangered. But if we look at Mammoth Cave, it's small, way smaller, right, than these other two. Right, it's only 52,000 acres, and we're talking millions over here. So it's only 52,000 acres. It's got 130 species total, 50 of which are endangered. And so we want to think about how fragile is the habitat. Eastern Kentucky forest, there's been people logging those and building houses in those for 300 years. They're still here. They're, pretty tough. Compared to, say, Mammoth Cave. The inside of this cave ecosystem is really fragile, right? So if you were to go in here, one person could destroy 10,000 years worth of cave formation growth, and things like that. So it's really fragile. There's a whole lot of endangered things proportionately. So we probably want to buy this, right? So we probably want to conserve this place if that was what our money. If we could only do one, that would probably be our spot because it's really fragile and has a high proportion of endangered species. So now we'll look at the important considerations conservationists have to make, right? So our little thought experiment there, we kind of thought about some of them, but now let's see what they got to do, right? So we got to see, if we're trying to save something, which is what conservationists are trying to do, and conservation biology is trying to do, is keep stuff around. Something that's completely extinct and truly extinct, it's already lost. We lost that battle. We can't do anything about it. So, for instance, the passenger pigeons. These are truly extinct. The species is gone from Earth forever. Not going to see them again. Now, maybe with modern genetic engineering, and so maybe we could do some Jurassic Park stuff and bring one back, but that's going to be really expensive and impractical. So passenger pigeons are truly extinct, meaning their entire species is dead and gone. We'll never see them again, which is sad because there used to be billions of them. Okay, so wolves. Wolves are what we call locally extinct. And here in Kentucky, we don't have wolves, right? I mean, there might be somebody's that's got a wolf as a pet in their backyard or something crazy, but historically we had wolves that lived in Kentucky, and now we've killed them all, so they're locally extinct. Their species still exist, other places, they're locally extinct here. Tigers over in Asia are what we call ecologically extinct. And what ecologically extinct means is that this species, there's so few of them in their environment that they don't affect it anymore. Their niche is functionally not really doing anything. So there's only a couple hundred tigers left, and even though tigers used to eat stuff, all the big animals, they used to eat them and have an effect, there's so few of them left that they don't really have any kind of an effect on their ecosystem. So that's what ecologically extinct means. And the term endemic here, endemic means that a species is restricted to somewhere. So the red swamp crayfish, they're endemic to the southeastern U.S. These brown states are where they're from, kind of the Mississippi River drainage there. They used to be restricted there, but through boats and people and things like that, they've been moved around, and now they exist in all these red states and Hawaii. So they've gotten a ride on boats and things and moved around. So they've been introduced there, and they're displacing native species. Okay, so we can have locally endemic species, which means they're restricted to an even smaller area, right? The red crayfish, it's endemic to the southeastern U.S., pretty big area, the brown here, right? But locally endemic things can be really, really restricted. So we look at the bottlebrush crayfish. It exists only in the Barren River and Green River systems in central Kentucky. So basically inside this red circle is the only place on Earth this thing exists. So it has a lot higher risk of going extinct than this red swamp crayfish, right? Because this thing is now all over the U.S., so the odds of it going extinct are pretty low. This thing, it's in one river. You have one good toxic sludge spill into that river, and now you've wiped out that whole species, right? So it has a higher risk of extinction. So being locally endemic kind of puts you at danger for being extinction. And so we're going to look at how do we know if something's locally endemic, and how do we compare these different places, right? So we get these measurements of how to measure different areas. And we call this alpha, beta, and gamma diversity. So alpha diversity is going to be how many different species are in one spot. It's this island here, alpha diversity of 2. So there's this island here, alpha diversity of 1, alpha diversity of 1. So that's how many are in that one spot. Beta diversity is how many are there between nearby ecosystems, right? So beta diversity here, we've got island 1 and island 2. We'll do beta diversity there. So there's 3 different species of turtles. But this 1,000 miles apart island over here that's got this funky looking turtle on it compared to these turtles, it's not close enough for beta diversity to really be a thing. And so to include it, we use what's called gamma diversity. And this is geographic scale diversity. So, all across the state or all across the country, we've got this gamma diversity, right? So in our scenario here, gamma diversity would equal 4 because we got these 4 different kinds of turtles. And this is species diversity is what we're using in this case. So now let's do a little applying this, right? So we've got these 3 wetlands with frogs. And if the frog looks different, it's a different species. So we want to determine the alpha, beta, and gamma diversity in the habitats below. So I'll let you work on that for a moment. Okay, so we've got wetland A here, and we've got 1 frog, 2 frog, 3 frog, 4 frog. So we've got 4 different kinds of frogs in wetland A, right? So we're going to have a richness of 4, our alpha diversity of 4 here. And then wetland B, we got 1, 2, 3, 4. We also have 4 different ones here. So we got alpha of 4, alpha of 4. Our beta diversity between wetland A and wetland B, we got this one. It's over here too. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we come over here and we're like, hey, look, a new one, 5. So now we have 5 would be our beta diversity between these two. Our beta diversity between this one and this one would be 1, 2, 3, 4. That one's the same as over here. That one's the same as over here. That one is different, right? So now we're up to 5, and this one's also different. We're up to 6. And at the landscape level, or the gamma diversity level, that's also what we have is 6. Okay. And so we're talking about these numbers and having more. We often think that more is better, and that increasing is always a good thing, but not always, right? So if you're managing this forested stream valley, would you consider putting a dam in the creek to make a pond to increase, the diversity within that valley? Because now, if you have a pond, you're going to have different stuff like frogs and beavers and bluegill and stuff going to be in there, right? Well, is it a good thing to do? Think about that for a minute. Okay, what if there's a locally endemic endangered turtle species, right? Maybe this, and this could vary, maybe this turtle likes ponds. Maybe this turtle's a dryland turtle and hates ponds, which we would call it a tortoise technically in that case, but, we can still call it a turtle. So that could change our opinion, right? If we have this endangered endemic, meaning locally endemic, meaning it's going to be restricted to this area, so it doesn't occur anywhere else in the world. Okay, now what if there's a locally endemic species of moss present? So moss is, the little green stuff in the woods growing on rocks and trees, and maybe it likes to grow on the rocks in the creek or on the side of the stream, or these things could change our idea of if increasing biodiversity is always good. And so it's kind of, well, it depends, right? Maybe it's good in some instances. It's usually good, but if it's going to harm some endangered species that's restricted to a small area, maybe it's not so good. So that's just kind of think about that. And you'll hear some verbs associated with biodiversity. So we'll hear people say maintain, and probably within this PowerPoint I've used some of these verbs already. So maintain, simply means to keep all the elements of biodiversity on Earth from diminishing. So this is the number one goal to conservation biologists and conservation scientists. We want to keep stuff around. Maybe that frog that carries its babies in its mouth has some enzyme that can cure cancer, but we don't know now because it's extinct. So we want to keep stuff around, both because it has a right to exist and it's cool, and because maybe it'll make us money or save the world later on. So it's important to keep things around for lots of reasons. Restoring. Some people call themselves restoration biologists, or that kind of thing. And to restore, that verb means to return an ecosystem to its previous state. This could be before human activity, or not. It could be maybe a landslide happened and plugged up the creek, and but usually we are the thing that screws stuff up, humans. So almost always we screw something up and then we got to fix it. So to restore is to return it to the previous state before humans. To conserve is to use biodiversity carefully so it will not diminish in the long term. And this is important for like foresters and fish and wildlife biologists and people like that, because these are things we use. They're natural resources that we use, but that's why they're called conservation officers, game warden, because we want to use it in such a way that it's there for your kids and your grandkids and etc. So that's what that means. Okay, having stuff stay around and using it, we we want to use things sustainably, right? We have to use stuff, so we want to do it in such a way that it stays here. And so sustainability means the ability to maintain something over time without diminishing it, right? So this is, yeah, we're cutting down trees for houses, but we're not clear cutting the whole, mountain. We're just cutting trees here and there and allowing them to grow back before we cut them again, right? So using these natural resources sustainably prevents us from running out. And in some cases, it might be like farming them, right? Like tree plantations are a thing. People farm trees. But doing it in such a way that they're still going to be there is a good thing. Sustainability you can use this verb and this idea so that future generations can just enjoy nature, right? Like elephants. Elephants don't really, make us money, and we don't build houses out of them, but they're pretty cool. They're huge, and they're different than everything else on Earth. They're the last of their kind, and so it's pretty cool to see an elephant. And so, thinking sustainably is just so that it's there for future generations to enjoy. And so I think this cartoon kind of hits home to kind of how we think about things, right? So you got this guy, he's, a portly fellow, probably owns that oil company across the river there, complaining to the rabbit, you overpopulate the land and destroy everything because, the one rabbit is chewing on the tree, right? And so the rabbit's like, yeah, dude, whatever, look behind you. And so we often think of humans as being first when we think about sustainability. It's like, we didn't really do it. It's not our fault. Or it's like, yeah, those rabbits need that tree, but I want to build my house bigger and fancier. So I need that tree more than you. And so they're going to, people cut it down. So we always tend to think of ourselves first. And maybe we overuse resources instead of using them sustainably because we're not really considering the environment in the equation. So looking at these organisms, I misspelled the Beatles. That's funny. Think about what they do for the environment. What kind of benefits can they provide for humans as well as just their ecosystem? So mussels, I'm not sure what species this is, but mussels play a big part in cleaning up water, right? So they're filter feeders. They filter the water. And we've seen, like in Chesapeake Bay, they've reintroduced oysters, and they had really bad water quality in Chesapeake Bay from the Chesapeake River, from all the pollution, and they put all these oysters in there, and then boom, they're cleaning it up. They're making it like way healthier and cleaner because they're filtering out all the contaminants and algae and stuff, right? And so mussels can play a big role in that for us, for the ecosystem. They can provide food for species. And that cleaning of the water is important. Okay, so we got box turtles. Box turtles look cool. If you're a little kid and you're in the woods and you see a box turtle, you get excited. You're like, wow, turtle. And, they can be orange and yellow, and they're kind of pretty and cool. Those red, orange eyes. And so we can get enjoyment from them. Historically, some people ate them as food, like during the Great Depression and in pioneer times, so they can do that. For their ecosystem, they spread seeds, they eat insects, they consume some dead stuff, so they help move stuff around. So they're doing a good job there. These legume root nodules, and you're like, what the heck is a legume? What's a root nodule? What's that even mean? Well, some plants, like beans and peas, those are legumes, make these things on their roots called nodules. They're like little growths. And inside those growths, they house a special kind of bacteria. And this bacteria does something really fancy. It can take air, it can take nitrogen in the air, and convert it into a form of nitrogen that plants can use to absorb to make proteins and stuff with. And so this is really, really amazing. And we need this on Earth because we use a tremendous amount of fossil fuels to make nitrogen fertilizer every year in the world. But legumes do it for free. soybeans. Maybe you're a farmer. You know somebody that's a farmer. Well, they're going to put a whole lot more fertilizer on corn than they are on soybeans because the soybeans are making their own. So it's pretty cool. And these legume root nodules make nitrogen, which you can use to grow other plants. If you got plants growing near this, it's getting a benefit. Animals that eat it get a benefit. Alfalfa hay is a higher quality hay than just grass hay because it's a legume. It's got all this extra nitrogen, so the cows can grow more meat because meat's made out of nitrogen mostly. So this is really cool. They help us, they help the environment, they help the plant. They're pretty cool. And bats. Oh, look at that scary, big, mean, scary bat. Bats aren't scary. Bats are really, really cool. But if you're afraid of bats, you just need to be educated about them because usually humans, we fear things we don't know much about, right? And so bats are really super, super cool. It's very rare for a person to get rabies from a bat, which is something I hear all the time. Bats carry rabies. Well, yeah, they do. But how often do you grab a bat and let it bite you? Yeah, not very often, right? But the cool thing bats do for ecosystems is in caves, they bring in all the nutrients, right? They might go a mile back in a cave and bring in all the nutrients, and that ecosystem inside the cave is living on the bat poop. Well, so that's one benefit they have for ecosystems. And they can eat a lot of bugs. I have posted on Blackboard, have a video of a sonar. Sonar, is that what it's called? Doppler. No, it's Doppler radar. That's what it is. It's called Doppler radar. So it's like the stuff they use to measure weather. And there's in Texas, this big outbreak of moths. Millions of moths hatch, and you can see them flying, and then it gets dark and the bats come out. And in Texas, they have this species called the Mexican free-tailed bat that lives in really large colonies down there. And so then this bat comes and just wipes out all the moths. It's really cool. You'll have to watch that. It's on Blackboard. It's pretty cool. And so bats eat up to 1,000 mosquitoes a night, per bat. So they can really, really help us out a lot by eating pests. Ladybugs eat aphids. Aphids are a major agricultural pest for us. So ladybugs eat them. We don't have to spray for them. It's a win. Bees, be that honeybees or native bees, they're different, right? But in this picture, it's a honeybee. So what honeybees do, they pollinate things. So that flower, it's getting its pollen moved from one flower to another one so it can make more baby flowers and continue on its generations. What do bees do for us? We get honey and we get beeswax and we get our crops pollinated. Most crops that are bee pollinated, that are grown conventionally, now organic crops are different, but conventionally grown, like in conventional agriculture settings, they spray so many insecticides that there's no bees around. They're all dead. And so they have to bring in honeybees on semi-trucks to pollinate our crops. So think like all the apricots and peaches and almonds and grapes and stuff. They were all pollinated by bees that got moved in on a truck. So they provide a lot of services for us. So the next chapter is going to be species diversity. We're going to look, not just at biodiversity in general, but we're going to look at species diversity. And so after finishing this PowerPoint, you'll want to complete the Chapter 2 quiz.